Thanks, Robbie, and thanks very much for inviting me here. So when I titled my book, I have to say I never imagined that I would be speaking at a Christian university where I know heresy has a particular meaning. But I will say that I did intend it to have this kind of religious connotation in the sense that I think we're living in a time in which, at least for some chunk of the world, the technology itself has become a kind of religion. And the heresy that you'll see is that that our faith in technology is not necessarily well placed, at least with respect to certain kinds of change. So let me first just ask all of you, raise your hand if you own a smartphone. Okay, basically looks like everyone. Okay, I see somebody nodding in the back. Do you have a mobile phone? All right, so does anybody not have a mobile phone? I have a guest next week who apparently doesn't own a mobile phone, but it's increasingly difficult to find people like that. As you just saw, everybody owns a smartphone. How many of you believe life would be quite a bit more difficult if you didn't have a smartphone? Okay, quite a few hands. How many of you think life would be impossible without a smartphone? Okay, the one person who doesn't have a smartphone. That's interesting. Now, what about, do you think that overall society has benefited from this kind of technology? How many people think overall, yes? Even if in a small way. Okay, so the hands are up. Very good. So you are not alone. In fact, more and more there are people in the world who believe that technology is the fundamental way to move the world forward. This is Arne Duncan, who used to be our Secretary of Education, and he says that technology is a game changer in the field of education, a game changer we desperately need to both improve achievement for all and increase equity. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, instated a policy called internet freedom, and basically she suggested that the United States should put resources in its foreign policy to ensure that the internet was open and free for everybody in the world, because this access to a certain kind of information network would help citizens themselves hold their governments more accountable. And here is a quote from Mark Zuckerberg. He says, "The richest 500 million people have way more money than the remaining 6 billion combined. You solve that by getting everyone online." Okay. So yeah, I'm hearing some comments suggesting that seems kind of outrageous and ridiculous. But the amazing thing is that people say this with a straight face, and not only are these kinds of comments made, but there's very little pushback. Like Mark Zuckerberg doesn't hear a lot of people suggesting that doesn't make any sense. It's a little bit extreme. You might believe that getting people on the internet might help them in some ways, but solving deep problems like inequality seems very unlikely. Well, so. The reality is there are quite a few people increasingly who believe that technology is the answer to all kinds of social ills. But here's a very simple demonstration that suggests that they're not quite right, or at least that they don't have the full picture. So this is a graph from the United States Census Bureau. The bottom green line shows the rate of poverty in this country. And you can see it goes from about 1960 until pretty much the present day. And in the United States, poverty declined steadily between about 1940 through 1970. But then since then, you can see that it's basically been flat, right? Our fight against poverty has basically been stagnant. In fact, since the recent recession, poverty has actually gone up a little bit. Now, during those same 40 years when poverty went nowhere, we have basically seen golden age of digital innovation, right? So all of the technologies that we think of as being new, fancy, interesting, in fact, our mobile phones, the laptops that we use, a good chunk of the internet, all of that has been since about 1970. So if you believe in any narrative that suggests that more technology necessarily addresses social problems like poverty or inequality or even, say, political polarization, that doesn't seem to be quite borne out by even this very simple facts. And you can, these are facts that are available for anybody to look up. You can find the graph at the United States Census Bureau, and when these things were invented is public knowledge. I sometimes show another graph in which you see political polarization in this country also getting worse throughout basically the same period. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the technology is at fault, but I think it's pretty clear that in any case, the technology isn't enough to address those issues. So the question is why? And in order to answer that, I'm going to actually take you a little bit through my own journey of coming to understanding about how technology actually works with respect to society. So as you heard from Robbie, I used to work at Microsoft Research. I was there for 12 years as a research scientist. And I went to India in the last 5 of those years to help start this research lab. Now, you might have heard in news articles that India is kind of an IT superpower. These days, a lot of software companies are based in India. Many US companies outsource a lot of software engineering to India, and so on. But India is actually, a very interesting place. When this is right outside our offices, we would routinely see, cows walking on the roads, bullock carts, and so on. It's a country that's still extremely poor by most of our standards. 2/3 of the country earns less than a couple of dollars a day, and they depend on some form of agriculture for their livelihood. So when I moved to India, I also switched research direction. I used to do research in an area that's called computer vision, which is, you can think of as a subset of artificial intelligence. But when I moved to India, I wanted to find different ways to use technology to help with poverty alleviation in the country since I was there. And I'll tell you about one of those projects. So this man is a sugarcane farmer. He lives in a rural area about 3 hours outside of Bombay. And what we did was to work with this one sugarcane cooperative, which a couple of years before I got there had received a grant from the government to install internet kiosks in the villages that it worked with as a way to help farmers. And so the initial conception of this project was that these villages are pretty much disconnected from the rest of the world. If you provide internet access to them, they'll be able to get distance education. The farmers will be able to get more information about how to do better agriculture. In some cases, they might provide healthcare information that they need, and so on and so forth. But when we got there, what we found was that the computer systems were in terrible condition. So this is one of them. I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but the machines were literally covered in dust. They were often kept in places like fertilizer sheds because a lot of these villages just didn't have a lot of modern buildings. And apparently rats routinely would chew up the cords because something about the rubber in the cords was tasted good for them. And so this cooperative spent quite a bit of its money trying to basically maintain the system. And meanwhile, we found that the farmers were not utilizing the system in any way as was initially conceived, right? So they were definitely not going online on a regular basis. Instead, what they just wanted was to be able to communicate with the cooperative so that they could find out how much of their sugarcane was actually processed when it was taken away to the processing center, how much it ultimately weighed at the end, and how much it was sold for. So a very small number of details, but ones that were vital for the farmers. With this particular system, the farmers are happy because they could get this information in a matter of weeks, rather than often the several months it would take before people actually came back from the processing center to report on these things to the farmers. And so we thought, well, this system is okay, but it seems to be falling apart. It's costly to maintain. And right around that time was when the world was really experiencing this dramatic rise of mobile phones. And so we piloted a very simple solution in which we basically allowed the farmers to text for this information to the processing center, and the processing center had a database that was also attached to a mobile phone, which basically sent the correct information back. Over a couple of months when we piloted it, we found that farmers got used to using this. They liked it for a number of reasons. They liked it because, first of all, they didn't have to go to the village kiosk to get this information. They could do it with their own phones. We sometimes logged farmers who get up pretty early in the morning checking for these things at as early as 3 a.m. in the morning. And overall it was much cheaper. It didn't require any of the upkeep of the computer systems, and as far as the farmers were concerned, it was even faster than a computer system because they could get this information within seconds of making the query. So what we tried to do was we said, okay, well, this is working in the 7 pilot villages that we worked in. Why don't we take this to the remaining 54 villages that you serve as a cooperative? And so that's exactly what we tried to do. Unfortunately, we ran into some kind of internal political problem at the cooperative itself. So when we were doing this project, we were working primarily with the technical staff, and they were very excited about it. But there was some, as far as we could tell, there was some kind of rivalry between the head of the technical division and the actual managing director of the cooperative. And so, the managing director was not as excited to have this roll out. And at the time, we were researchers. We were just people coming in from the outside, and it didn't seem like we had the capacity to resolve that internal issue. Now, over the 5 years that I was in India, we did projects in healthcare, in governance, in agriculture, in education, in microfinance, and I would say I probably oversaw about 50 different projects, all of which involved some kind of digital technology trying to be used for the purposes of poverty alleviation, for the purposes of helping rural parts of India do better. And my ultimate conclusion after those 50 projects was that you can have the best designed technology in the world, but it doesn't ultimately solve some of the deeper social, political, cultural issues that we were trying to address. And I'm a computer scientist by training, and so what I really want to understand was why, what's the way to think about this so that I can explain? Because in a few cases, we would often find that the technology worked in a small pilot condition, right? But when we tried to scale it up, it just did not go very far. And so the best way I can think about it is a very simple idea, and it's that technology on the whole amplifies underlying human forces. It is not, particularly difficult concept, and in fact, if you read a lot about technology in society, you see people referring to this idea very casually, but it hasn't been really theorized in a deep way. And I think one of the things that we are missing as a society is a deeper appreciation for what this really means, because it leads to all kinds of consequences that are sometimes counterintuitive. So I'm going to ask you about actually 3 very quick questions to give you some intuition for what this really means. Okay, so here's the first one. Okay, imagine you're the CEO of a for-profit corporation that is not meeting its sales goals despite having a good product. Okay, and the question is, what should you do to turn this around? Okay, and this is a forced choice question, so I'm going to force you to answer with one of the multiple choice options. Obviously, depending on the context, it's going to be a little bit different, but just imagine in some general case, what do you think it would be? So A, create a new strategy, B, replace the leadership team, C, provide more training to sales staff, and D, buy iPads for all the employees. So yeah, I get laughter a lot for this question, and it seems quite obvious that answer D isn't going to work, nor is E, upgrade the data center, or F, give employees productivity software. Now, this might seem obvious, and the interesting thing is I've actually asked very similar questions to venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, to technology entrepreneurs, and they all agree. They all know that in order to run a successful company, the most important thing is the team. And for example, among venture capitalists, there's a famous saying that what you're investing in is not the idea or the product, but the management team. So they know this at some level. On the other hand, as soon as it becomes, the question becomes slightly different, right? So for example, imagine that you're the superintendent of a failing school system that is not graduating all of its students. What should you do? Strangely enough, the answer often becomes, let's get every kid an iPad. Or let's fix the data center that's serving our teachers, or so on. So this is a photograph I took I used to live in the Seattle area, and I volunteered for this nonprofit that tried to basically provided an after-school class that was meant to teach computer literacy to kids who didn't otherwise have a chance to interact with technology at school. And what I found was that even for the goal of teaching computer literacy, the biggest obstacle to teaching was the computer. So these kids were between the 3rd and 5th grade, and I have a lot of teaching experience. I have to say they were the hardest students I've ever had to teach. As soon as my back was turned from any of them, they would find from whatever place they could some video game to play, and they would play it. And I always thought I would turn I'd make sure that the wireless is off so that they couldn't go to the online. I would delete all the games I could find on the computer, and they would still find these games. I just don't understand how that worked. So eventually I had to, because I was a new teacher, I basically went to the other teachers and just watched what they did. And I found that the other teachers routinely would have the students not use the technology, even when it was in theory a technology class. And the basic idea was that with kids, the technology is I think of it now as cognitive candy, right? It's like, all of the things you can do with technology are great, but it's kind of like giving them a buffet style dinner with the dessert all there, and then saying, here, you go and have whatever food you want. Most kids are going to go straight to the dessert and start stuffing themselves with it. But as adult supervisors, we want to help guide them towards the more nutritious meals. And that guiding process, however gentle it is critical, right? Like, you just cannot leave the kids alone with the full buffet at their disposal. So yes, so this idea that you can use technology by itself without some other human intervention in context, whether it's education or healthcare or governance or community life, I think is deeply flawed. All right, so let me ask you another question. This one, in which of the following countries is democratic free speech most available online? Okay, and I should mention that this is not a trick question. Okay, so A is North Korea. Does anybody think North Korea? No. B, China. C, Russia. D, the United States. All right, so all the hands went up for United States, and of course that is correct. My favorite photograph of the internet in North Korea is this one. This would never happen in the United States. So in North Korea, they have a very interesting setup with respect to the internet. They have created a separate internet that is totally disconnected from the rest of the world's internet, but using the same technical protocols. So if you take your laptop there and you plug it in, it still works, but you will not have access to Google, to Facebook, to the New York Times, to the Wall Street Journal, to anything that you normally routinely have access to here. They don't have, because they just have websites that were generated in North Korea. They probably have very similar, this kind of information is actually very hard to get, but they probably have similar kinds of websites, like copies of something that looks like Facebook, copies of things that are like Google, but they will not have the actual internet that the rest of the world sees. And you can be pretty sure that nobody on that internet is criticizing the supreme leader, right? So that's North Korea. In China, there's a very different system. So China has, China occasionally blocks internet access to certain sites on the rest of the world's internet, but generally average citizens have access to most of the other internet content in the rest of the world. But China has an amazing system in which something like 400,000 people are paid to be censors online. And there's a political scientist at Harvard University who studied this by actually starting his own social media company in China. And he discovered that when you do that, you get all this kind of advice, both from the government as well as from other firms that basically tell you how to censor social media information. So he's extracted some information that way, as well as observing how actual social media content gets censored. And what he's found is that basically within 24 hours of something being posted, if it's objectionable to the Communist Party, it gets deleted. So that's an amazing censorship machine that the Chinese government has put into place. And then in Russia, they're actually quite free about what anybody can post. But the government hires an army of internet trolls who basically pretend to be regular citizens, but they're spewing government propaganda. Right, so what's interesting about these three cases is, they're all countries that have a communist background or history or are currently communist. But they're different in the way they deal with stuff online. And the difference is interesting because it kind of reflects the actual real life political situation, right? It's not that the internet is the same everywhere, and it's certainly not that the internet brings democracy to countries when it arrives, as sometimes you hear in the press, but it's more that the internet is an amplification of the underlying political situation. So what I always say is that in the United States, we happen to have free speech online because we have free speech offline, not the other way around. All right, so last question. Most of you have probably heard about massive open online courses. These are MOOCs, which when they were first became popular a few years ago, a lot of people said, people will no longer have to pay for expensive higher education because all of this information will be available online for free. In the United States, especially, you can walk into any public library and there's an internet-connected computer. So all of a sudden, anybody can get a college education online, basically free, right? So several years after that, we now have very concrete data, often collected by these organizations that run these MOOCs. And what do you think is the answer to this question? Which of the following groups most often completes massive open online courses? Any ideas? C, yes, that's correct. So all the data suggests that the people who complete these courses the most are, in fact, white men who are college-educated professionals with jobs, not high school dropouts who most need that education. And there's various reasons for this, but one of them I think is that if you have a hard menial task job during the day, the last thing you think you're going to want to do when you go home is then invest a lot of effort in trying to learn difficult content online. Whereas for a lot of white-collar workers, they see it as a kind of side hobby. It's like, oh, I'd like to learn a new skill. Let me go home and have this kind of fun. So there's a huge difference in the outcome that has nothing to do with whether the content is readily available online or offline. So that takes us back to this graph and why it might be that despite the fact that we have these amazing technologies, it doesn't appear that they have made dramatic dents in at least not all of the social problems that we care about. So the way I think about this is, again, amplification. And I think in this country, we have a deep cultural, social, political challenge in which, as a country, we are not agreed on how to address problems like poverty. And so because we're not agreed on it, there's not enough consensus. And so despite the fact that we have amazing technologies, there's nothing for that technology to amplify to cause that to happen. On the other hand, I would argue that if our political situation became more unified and we did have a better plan for addressing poverty, that then all of a sudden you'd see the technologies also kind of almost magically amplify that underlying social tendency, and we'd see the technology helping as well. So again, for the most part, technology amplifies underlying human forces. By itself, it doesn't fix dysfunctional institutions. It doesn't make education better in and of itself. It doesn't improve governance or make things more democratic in and of itself. It doesn't shrink inequality in and of itself. So if I were to stop there, this would be a very depressing talk. So the real question is, what does this mean? Now, I would say amplification is still a very powerful force. I'm not saying that the technology does nothing, and I'm not saying that the technology is inherently bad. It's really about how do you ensure that the amplification allows the technology to have positive impact. So the way that I think about this is that it's sort of like, the engine in your car, right? You can make the engine more and more powerful, faster and faster and faster. But in the end, you need a good, safe human driver who knows where they're going in order for the car to reach the destination. And in a ironic way, the more powerful the engine becomes, the more important it is for the people driving the cars to be safer, to be better trained, and so on. Which is why astronauts who fly to outer space, they go through years of training. They're already highly talented individuals, and that's because they have major engines that they're basically handling. So the most essential thing, I think, is having the right human forces in place. And sometimes I get asked the question, what does it mean, the right human forces? Well, since I'm at a context where I think people are very comfortable talking about virtue and so on, I would say it's virtuous human forces. You need the right virtuous human forces in place for the technology to ultimately have something positive to amplify. So what kind of consequences does it have more specifically for technology? One thing, as I mentioned very briefly about in the context of education, is sometimes we just have to say no to technology because there's nothing positive to amplify, or because the positive things that might be amplified are outweighed by the negative things that might be amplified. So I'm now a university professor, and one of the things I find is that if I allow my students to leave their laptops open throughout class, they will no longer pay attention to me. I hear some of the faculty laughing. That's probably because they have experienced this phenomenon. And this is a photograph that somebody took of behind somebody's class, and you can see nobody is doing the schoolwork. They're like watching videos of babies. There's Facebook open, things like that. And I've experienced this myself on the other side, right? So I've certainly been at meetings where I have my laptop open, and then I look back and go, oh, I don't think I remember anything from that meeting. So it's a fundamental issue, which is that as human beings, we have a tendency to be distracted easily, and the fact is, a lot of the content that's online is designed to be distracting, right? So, these days people talk about clickbait, which is meant to be, little headlines to make you want to click on that thing because you get curious about what that issue is. And increasingly, the world is becoming better and better and better at generating that clickbait because now they also have all this data about, who clicks on what and what things are more likely to be clicked on. Right, so the world is becoming better and better at this, which means sometimes we should just close our laptops, shut down our mobile phones or whatever, so that we can concentrate on whatever it is that we're focused on, not necessarily on the distractive things. That's not to say, again, that I don't think technology can be useful in education. I certainly have exercises that I run in classes which require laptops and mobile phones, and for those exercises, it's certainly allowed. The other side of the coin is to think about, okay, so let's suppose you are in a position to provide technology for somebody. What's the best way to use it? So when I was in India, there were a few projects that did quite well, not just as research projects, but also went on to achieve larger scale change. This is a project by one of my former researchers, Rick Gandhi. He now runs a nonprofit called Digital Green. And the project was basically to use video of how-to techniques of agricultural practices with actual farmers as actors, and then to use those videos as a kind of core part of group watching and group learning about the new practices. And what we found is that despite the use of additional equipment and so on, that because we can do this with less trained staff, the overall impact on agriculture is as much as 10 times more cost effective than the more traditional ways of agricultural education, which often involve this very intensive one-to-one type interaction. Now, the important thing about this particular project is that even though we have a really interesting technology solution and we know that it works, it critically depends on organizations that have feet on the ground and that have established rapport with farmers. So Digital Green, basically kind of piggybacks on other organizations that already have an established presence in rural areas, and then teaches the technique to those organizations so that they can more effectively deliver the agricultural content that they're trying to deliver. If we only had the videos and let's say put them on YouTube, we're pretty sure that none of this impact would happen. In fact, we do have a lot of the content up online, but it's not average farmers that are looking at them. Mostly it's curious, either curious people or people exactly at these kinds of organizations that work with farmers. And so this is an instance where if you have a technology solution, what you want to do is find organizations that are already meeting some aspect of your eventual goals and then help basically amplify that impact. So number 3 is a consideration for those of you who might end up at some of these technology companies. As I mentioned, that we're increasingly moving in a direction in which the technology is becoming incredibly powerful. So this image that you see is a really, both I would say striking but also somewhat scary image. I used to do work in an area called computer vision, which is really about the automated understanding of imagery. So the way I used to describe this problem was that if I give the computer a photograph, right, I want the computer to spit out a reasonable text description of what's contained in that photograph. Even now, that problem is still very difficult, but it's increasingly being solved. So there are researchers both at Google and at Stanford University and increasingly at other places where they can do exactly the task that I just described. And to me, when I was a graduate student, I used to think that that was a technology I was not going to see in my lifetime. And surprisingly, it's pretty much here today, and it will probably get better and better and better. This particular image is interesting because it basically takes the same underlying software that does that kind of image recognition, but runs it in a reverse. So you start with an image, and then it says, I want to see things that are more dog-like in the image. And then it modifies the image in the direction that it thinks would make it so. And so what you see is all these kind of quasi-dog-like animals. And it's eerie how dreamlike it is, right? It looks like somebody's real art project as opposed to something designed by a computer. And to me, this is a sign that we are getting very, very close to having computers not just be smart in the ways that they're already smart, but also begin to assume a lot of the capabilities that human beings have. In technology circles, there's this idea called the singularity, which is the moment when computers become smarter than human beings in every way. And the reason why it's called the singularity is that at that point, things become completely unpredictable because computers would basically be able to make themselves smarter, right, in a way that we cannot. So for example, we don't know how to perform surgery on ourselves to make ourselves smarter. But computers, because they'll have access to the same underlying programming that allows them to do what they do, would be able to change that programming on their own so that it becomes increasingly smart. The way I think about this kind of technology is that it would be like the atomic bomb of digital technology. And compared to that, I think we're still only playing with plastic toy guns. So the question becomes, who is going to be in charge of that incredibly powerful technology? So with nuclear weapons, for the most part, nuclear weapons today are still in the hands of governments, which, despite their challenges, are mostly accountable to their citizens, and so far have handled them reasonably responsibly, right? We don't see too many nuclear bombs going off on a regular basis, and that's a great thing. With this other technology, it's very likely going to be in the hands of a few large corporations whose primary goal is not making sure their citizens are safe and happy, but whose primary goal is increasing shareholder value. And to me, that suggests that we as a society need to really work harder to ensure that the right kinds of regulations are in place so that this very powerful technology is used for improving our society overall, not just making some people richer. Luckily, I think there is some recognition of this fact. The US government recently has been holding several workshops about artificial intelligence and what it possibly means for society and what kinds of regulations might be required. So there's a little bit of an awakening, but I think we still need to do quite a bit more. And the one thing that I would say to people who might end up in technology companies is that if you end up in a technology company, you potentially have the chance to affect how the technology is being used internally. And so to the extent that you can bring about that change internally within a corporation, I think that would be a positive thing. Moving on, so again, going back to this analogy of cars and drivers, in a world in which we have more and more powerful technologies, it's all the more important that we focus on just basic, fundamental human development, whether it's better upbringing, better education, better vocational training. In 2002, I taught calculus in Ghana for a few months, and this woman, Regina Ajari, was one of my students. In fact, she was my top student in that course. She went to a school called Ashesi University, which was founded by a former Microsoft employee who was Ghanaian. And his vision was that he basically said, in Africa, only about 5% of the population actually goes through university, which kind of means that if you can mold that 5% to be ethical, responsible leaders, then in another generation, they will be the ones leading the continent. And so if you can affect this very small percentage of the population in the right way, they'll ultimately change the world for the better. And we're already beginning to see results of that. So Regina, she graduated about 10 years ago. She worked for a bank for a long time. She was interested in just being a software engineer and really watching out for her own financial security. But after about 10 years, she said, there was this voice in my head that that kept calling me back to what we were kind of asked to do in university, which was to be leaders that were contributing back to society. And so she quit her job, started a consulting firm, and then that serves middle and small enterprises in Ghana, and then takes 80% of the profits from that consulting firm to fund a foundation that teaches girls in the country how to program, so that they might have the kind of life that she leads. And so I think this is a great example of the kind of impact that you can have exactly in the kind of educational settings that we are all a part of, and which whose impact you don't often see in the short term, but which can often blossom in a significant way in the future. And then finally, I think it's important to have virtuous individuals, but we also want to have societies that are virtuous, that have the capacity to take care of their own citizens and that nurture good citizens. And so the question is, what does it take to do that? So one of the things that I find among my colleagues who work on technology for social change is that they tend to they think of problems in the way that technologists think of problems, which is, if I provide the right solution, everything becomes better the next moment, right? And the reality with human organizations is that we are creatures of inertia and habit, which means that it often takes a long amount of pushing and shoving and nudging and encouraging and sometimes scolding to get us to change. And that kind of change can take generations. But if you do it well, it can be surprisingly effective. So I'm going to tell you a story that has nothing to do with kind of social progress, but it's still, I think, an inspiring story for those of us who are interested in social change. So Venezuela, up until the 1970s, Venezuela is an oil-rich country, and so the national government had quite a bit of money to use for all kinds of national projects. And one of the things that they did was they funded several national orchestras. And because they had the money, they basically would hire the best musicians from all around the world, often from Europe, and then basically pay to have them come to Venezuela and man orchestras in Venezuela. Around the 1970s, there was a man and also a classically trained violinist and pianist by the name of Jose Abreu, and he said, we have to hire other people to play the music that we love. Why don't we help nurture that talent in our own country? So he started a youth orchestra. Apparently, this is another one of these in his basement type stories. And it started off with 11 people who first came, and they rehearsed all day. And the next day, 24 people came, and so on, until by the end of the month, he had 72 people, most of them who have never touched an instrument, all wanting to play in this orchestra. And the stories are that they would rehearse for like 12 hours a day. And by the end of a year or two, they were a reasonably capable orchestra, to the extent that the president of Mexico once heard them and said, hey, why don't you come and play for us in Mexico? And from there, this orchestra became better and better known. And over the last 40 years, the program has grown from this very small single orchestra to now basically receiving funds from both the government of Venezuela as well as entities like the World Bank. And now it basically has 400,000 students across the country. The entire country now is actually well versed in at least being appreciators of classical music. I've heard that there are cows in the rural areas named Mozart and Beethoven. And this man, who's the conductor in this photograph, is Gustavo Dudamel. He is now the musical director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, which is considered one of the best orchestras in the world. So he's a product of this system, which didn't exist 40 years ago. So what that shows you is that you can create this kind of amazing national level scale change that reaches excellence in a single generation if you single-mindedly put your mind to it and kind of establish both an organization and a social movement behind it. And I think that's the same mindset we have to have with a lot of the kind of social change we want to see, which is that it's necessarily a long-term game, but with the right sincerity and earnestness and effort, it can be achieved in a lifetime. It's something that can be done relatively quickly. In contexts where I'm personally concerned most with how do you address poverty, and I think it's the same issue. Poverty isn't an issue of somehow finding the way to get money to people who are poor. It's really a question of how do you get society as a whole to make sure that every individual is able to make a productive contribution that somebody else would pay for. And that question is one of really nurturing both the people who don't have those skills to have those skills, but also nurturing the rest of us to be concerned about this problem, because it's eventually going to be a problem that all of us are going to have to deal with one way or another. So with that, let me summarize. My main core message about technology is that technology amplifies underlying human forces, and what that means is that technology, however great it is, doesn't by itself address all kinds of social problems. It doesn't fix dysfunctional institutions. It doesn't democratize countries. It doesn't shrink inequality. But the other side of this is that, especially in a world of powerful technologies, it's all the more important that we focus on human development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Toyama. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If there are maybe 2 or 3 questions that you have for Dr. Toyama. In English literature, with both Huxley and Orwell, they have dystopias where technology is used bad. And I believe also that there's a lot of Japanese literature that is dystopian. Have you thought at all about the negative technology can amplify for good? Technology probably can amplify for evil.
Right.
Have you thought about that issue at all?
Absolutely, yeah. So you saw in my examples with these more oppressive countries and how they actually use the technology for their own, somewhat more oppressive purposes. So it can be used for evil. You mentioned, well, and that's really interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Neil Postman. He was a media critic in the 80s, and he actually said that the world we used to be worried about an Orwellian world in which the government basically controlled all aspects of our lives with this very kind of oppressive force. But actually, we should be more afraid of a Huxleyan world in which all of us are sedated by soma, which was this drug-like thing that everybody ate in Brave New World, and where we don't think we're unhappy, but actually we're still stagnating as a society and not doing positive things. And I actually think in some ways our technology is becoming that drug, right? So the same distractive forces that I mentioned about, in an educational context, I mean, they're everywhere now, where, most of us, we have such an easy way to kind of alleviate whatever internal angst that we have by watching Netflix movies or, going on Facebook or whatever, that we might not be attending to those problems as mindfully as we could. And so it might mean that the problems are left unsolved, whereas possibly a previous generation, because they didn't have so many other entertainment options, had to address those. And so I think there's a very real possibility that the amplification is happening in a way that it's amplifying our negative kind of tendency to be complacent more than, our potential for good. But I have to say, this is, we don't know. There's always in every generation, there are people who suggest that the new technology is in some form bad, and others who think it's good. And every generation seems to survive those problems, and then there are new problems. There's a famous story about how Socrates used to worry that writing was a bad, corrupting thing, because now all of a sudden people wouldn't be able to memorize, Homeric poems in their head. And that's certainly true, but I would say on the whole we've benefited from that technology. I do think there is real cause to be worried with additional technology. So for example, since you mentioned English literature, one thing that I worry about now is the very ease of producing and consuming video content is, I think, potentially contributing to a situation where people are less literate than a previous generation. In other words, they're less able to absorb and extract meaning from text. I noticed that there's a generational difference. Like, I find it painful to have to watch videos for informational content. Like, I would much rather read the transcript. But I find with many of my students, they would much rather prefer that everything I assigned were a video to watch rather than reading things. And I think that's potentially interesting because in some sense it's a retrogression, right? We went from a society that understood everything visually and orally and so on, and in some sense writing has allowed us to think in a way that was not previously possible. And now we're going back to a world in which everything is again visual and audio and not strictly and not necessarily written. And so there's some potential danger. I'm not sure that how things will work out in the end. I think human beings are amazingly resilient and resist too much positivity or negativity in either direction. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
You started off talking about how your institution that you talked about virtue and audience here, message that development is fundamental on the empire. I'm curious though as to what kind of audience response you got more technical.
Sure.
You get a lot of pushback, because I think, as you said,
Right, no, that's a great question. I would say that, if you push even fairly excited technologists to the limit, very few of them will say that the technology by itself solves everything. But they still have this intuition that somehow overall things get better with more technology. And so they tend to find very clever ways to justify and rationalize their emphasis on technology. I have a lot of my colleagues who are technologists, they will habitually say things like, well, technology will only address 10% of the solution. And so then I always ask them, well, why are you focusing on the 10% when there's this other 90%? And they're like, well, other people can address those other 90%. But I think that's kind of true, right? I don't think we want a world in which there are no engineers, no technologists. But it does become a problem when, as a society, we tend to see that 10% as setting the cultural agenda for the rest of us. And so I think that's one of the bigger challenges. The other thing that I see is that many of the people that I speak to who are in the technology industry, to a great extent, they do understand this concept, and especially, because I intentionally try to show how, in some contexts, their logic is correct, but for some reason they're not willing to export that same logic to other contexts in which basically the same situation happens, and they understand that. But they often will say, that's great, but the problem is that I was hired to do this job, which is primarily technological in nature, and so I don't have the freedom to address those other questions. And so for a lot of technology audiences, in fact, I'll be in DC next week with a bunch of people who work on mobile technologies for education. And so, I do try to find ways to, to get them to think more about how they can work on the more human side of the issue.
Other questions? So are you ultimately optimistic
About this country? I have to say, given the current presidential election, I'm not too optimistic in the near term. I'm fundamentally optimistic about human beings. Like, I think we have built into us, this natural tendency to want to grow and become more than what we are, to become better versions of ourselves. I'm not optimistic that we're going to learn some of the lessons we need to learn without experiencing some significant crises. But hopefully those crises will be enough to tip us over in a more positive direction. I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a psychologist by the name of Steven Pinker who wrote a book called Better Angels of Our Nature. And he's basically shown that over the long arc of human civilization, that on the whole, violence committed by people against other people has declined, right? And despite all of the news that we're hearing, it's actually, we living in an amazingly safe world compared to, when we were hunter-gatherers living in very primitive tribes where, murder of other people was a routine kind of event. And so compared to those times, we live in much better times. Of course, it's not, I think one of the greatest challenges is it's not clear that our desire to consume more is something that we can rein in enough to prevent hitting some kind of resource, ceiling, which I think would be catastrophic. And so the question is whether we can wake up to these kinds of issues quickly enough and then respond quickly enough to them. But on the whole, I don't think we're going to be wiped out as a civilization. I think it's a question of, whatever we have to survive, how do we do afterwards?
We have time for maybe one more question. I guess not. So we'll stop there. Thank Dr. Brown.
Thank you.